Imagine walking into a bustling Chicago speakeasy during the Prohibition era, the air thick with cigar smoke and tension. Suddenly, a name cuts through the whispers: Al Capone. But who was the man behind the infamous gangster title? Was he just a ruthless mob boss, or something more? The real story of Al Capone is darker and far more complicated than you might think. Al Capone's story begins not in the crime-filled streets of Chicago, but in the humble neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, on a cold January day in 1899. Born to Italian immigrants Gabriele and Teresa Capone, who had sailed to America with dreams of a better life, Al was one of 9 children. His father was a hard-working barber, and his mother a skilled seamstress, both from a small village near Naples. The Capones settled in a modest apartment near the Navy Yard, and while their beginnings were humble, no one could predict the storm Alphonse Gabriel Capone would eventually unleash on the world. Growing up in Brooklyn, young Al was a bright student, but he struggled to fit in with the strict discipline of his Catholic school. At just 14, his temper got the better of him, and after striking a teacher, he was expelled. From that moment, Capone's life took a sharp turn. He bounced between odd jobs, working at a candy store, a bowling alley, and even playing semi-professional baseball. But it wasn't until he crossed paths with Johnny Torrio, a rising gangster, that his true destiny began to unfold. At the age of 19, Capone married May Coughlin, an Irish Catholic woman who had just given birth to their only son, Albert "Sonny" Capone. The marriage, by all accounts, was happy, despite the chaos that surrounded their lives. But as Capone's loyalty to Torrio deepened, so did his descent into the underworld, setting the stage for his rise as one of America's most notorious figures. Al Capone's path to infamy didn't begin with major crime syndicates, but rather with small-time gangs like the Junior 40 Thieves and the Bowery Boys in the streets of Brooklyn. It wasn't long before he graduated to the more notorious Brooklyn Rippers and eventually the feared 5 Points gang in Lower Manhattan. His entry into this world came through Frankie Yale, a racketeer who owned a Coney Island bar called the Harvard Inn. It was here, working as a bouncer, that Capone's life would take a fateful turn. One night at the Harvard Inn, Capone made the mistake of insulting a woman. Her brother, Frank Galluccio, didn't take kindly to the remark and slashed Capone's face 3 times, leaving him with the permanent scars that earned him the infamous nickname Scarface. Though Capone despised the name, preferring to be called Snorky by his closest friends for his sharp fashion sense, the scar would become a symbol of the ruthless man he was becoming. Capone often lied about his injuries, claiming they were the result of war wounds, adding to his growing legend. Despite the scars and the violence surrounding his early years, Capone's rise was just beginning. Under Yale's mentorship, Capone would learn the ins and outs of the criminal underworld, paving the way for his eventual reign over Chicago's underworld. In 1919, Al Capone left the streets of New York for Chicago, answering the call of Johnny Torrio, who had been brought in by crime boss Big Jim Colosimo to muscle through their operations. Capone's new life began as a bouncer in a Chicago brothel, an occupation that would leave him with more than just scars. It's believed that this is where Capone contracted syphilis, a disease that would eventually ravage his mind. Tragically, had he sought treatment early on, it could have been cured, but Capone never did. By 1923, Capone was starting to make a name for himself, even purchasing a modest home in the south side of Chicago for $5,500. That same year, he would make headlines for his involvement in the killing of Joe Howard, a hijacker who dared interfere with the Capone-Torrio bootlegging business. While Capone's involvement in Chicago's underworld deepened, his public persona took on an unexpected twist. He began appearing in sports pages as a boxing promoter, further blurring the lines between his criminal life and public image. After the murder of Big Jim Colosimo in 1920, which many suspected Capone had a hand in, Torrio inherited the criminal empire, with Capone as his trusted right-hand man. Torrio, ever cautious of turf wars, tried to mediate conflicts between rival gangs, but the brewing tension with the North Side Gang, led by Dean O'Banion, was unavoidable. When O'Banion was murdered in his flower shop in 1924, an assassination linked to Torrio, Capone was thrust into the heart of Chicago's bloody gang wars. It was a conflict that would only escalate, pushing Capone further into power, while rivals like Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran vowed vengeance. Though Capone was infamous for his Chicago empire, his reach extended beyond the city. He collaborated with Canadian bootleggers during Prohibition to smuggle liquor into the US. Though when asked about his ties to Canada's king of the bootleggers, Rocco Perry, Capone famously quipped, "Why, I don't even know which street Canada is on." Despite the quip, rumors swirled that Capone had hideaways in Canada, though official records dispute whether he ever actually set foot there. In January 1925, Capone narrowly escaped an ambush that left him rattled but unharmed. Just 12 days later, his mentor Johnny Torrio wasn't as lucky. After being shot multiple times, Torrio decided it was time to step aside, handing the reins of his criminal empire to Capone, just 26 years old. With control of illegal breweries and a network that stretched to Canada, Capone expanded his operation with ruthless efficiency, blowing up establishments that refused to buy his liquor. By the end of the 1920s, over 100 people had been killed in such bombings, and Capone's rivals blamed him for the growing number of brothels in Chicago. Capone wasn't just a crime boss, he was a man who knew how to blend in with the city's vibrant culture. He surrounded himself with members of the local black community, enlisting their help in his operations, and was a huge fan of jazz. He famously split a $100 bill in half, giving one half to a clarinetist and promising the other when the musician learned a song he requested. Capone's extravagant lifestyle, marked by custom suits, flashy jewelry, and fine dining, only cemented his image as a man of both power and excess. "I'm just a businessman, giving the people what they want," he would say. Despite his wealth and celebrity status, Capone knew he was a target. After surviving a machine gun attack by the North Side Gang in 1926, he called for a truce, but talks broke down. Just weeks later, his rival, Jaime Weiss, was killed outside his headquarters, and the gang wars escalated further. Capone became more paranoid, constantly moving between cities under assumed names. By 1928, seeking more peace of mind, he bought a luxurious home on Palm Island, Florida, far from the violent streets of Chicago that had made him both a king and a marked man. The feud between Al Capone and Joe Aiello was one of the bloodiest and most relentless battles in Chicago's underworld. In November 1925, when Capone's consigliere, Antonio Lombardo, was appointed head of the Unione Siciliana, a Sicilian-American organization, Aiello felt betrayed. Aiello, who had his eyes on the powerful position, blamed Capone for manipulating Lombardo's rise and severed all ties, setting the stage for a deadly rivalry. Desperate to take down Capone, Aiello allied with several of Capone's enemies and plotted multiple assassination attempts. One of the most infamous plots involved bribing the chef at Capone's favorite restaurant to poison his soup with prussic acid, offering as much as $35,000 for the job. The chef, however, revealed the plan to Capone, who retaliated by unleashing machine gun fire on Aiello's bakery, wounding Aiello's brother Antonio in the process. Despite repeated attempts to eliminate Capone, Aiello's efforts failed, and the men he hired to do the job met violent ends. He eventually put a $50,000 bounty on Capone's head, but all who tried to claim it were killed. Even when Aiello organized a series of machine gun ambushes aimed at both Capone and Lombardo, police received an anonymous tip and thwarted the attack, arresting several of Aiello's gunmen. When Aiello was taken into custody himself, Capone sent nearly 24 men to stand outside the police station, waiting for Aiello's release with the intent to kill him on sight. Aiello narrowly escaped this fate with a police escort, but his campaign against Capone was far from over as he fled to New Jersey to regroup. Al Capone's influence stretched far beyond the criminal underworld. He had deep ties to Chicago's political machine. In 1927, Capone played a significant role in securing the election of Republican mayoral candidate William Hale Thompson, who openly opposed Prohibition enforcement. Capone allegedly contributed $250,000 to Thompson's campaign, helping him defeat the Democratic incumbent, William Emmett Dever, by a narrow margin. With Thompson in office, Capone ensured his bootlegging empire had protection from the law, bringing a new level of corruption to city politics. By 1929, Capone's name was linked to several high-profile murders, including those of Assistant State Attorney William H. McSwiggan and Capone's former mentor, Frankie Yale. Despite the mounting body count and his growing notoriety, Capone's grip on Chicago politics and law enforcement remained ironclad, cementing his role not just as a mob boss, but as a kingmaker in the city's power structure. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre stands as one of the most infamous chapters in Al Capone's reign. Though Capone was in Florida at the time, many believed he had orchestrated the brutal event. The target was Bugs Moran, leader of the North Side Gang, who had been causing trouble for Capone by hijacking expensive shipments of Canadian whiskey. Moran had risen to power after his predecessors, Weiss and Drucci, were both killed in gang violence. Capone's men carefully planned the attack, even renting an apartment across the street from Moran's headquarters, a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 4 gunmen disguised as police officers staged a fake raid. They lined 7 of Moran's men against a wall and with machine guns and shotguns executed them in cold blood. Though the massacre was meant to eliminate Moran, he escaped the attack, leaving behind a bloody scene that shocked the nation. Photos of the slain bodies further tarnished Capone's reputation, and just days later, he was summoned to testify before a grand jury on Prohibition charges, though he managed to avoid attending citing illness. The massacre sparked widespread public outrage, damaging Capone's influence and casting a dark shadow over Chicago's political leadership. As a result, Mayor Thompson's association with Capone became a key issue, and in 1931, Anton J. Kermack won the mayoral race, vowing to clean up the city and sever ties with organized crime. Capone's ruthlessness was infamous, but he rarely got his hands dirty. He left that to others. In May 1929, his bodyguard Frank Rio uncovered a plot against him, orchestrated by 3 of Capone's men, Albert Anselmi, John Scalise, and Joseph Giunta, who had been persuaded by rival Joe Aiello to overthrow him. Capone, always one step ahead, invited the men to a lavish dinner. According to legend, after the meal, Capone beat them to death with a baseball bat, then ordered his bodyguards to finish them off. This brutal scene was immortalized in the film The Untouchables, though historians like Deirdre Bair and William Hazelgrove question the story's plausibility, noting how unlikely it would be for 3 hardened killers to sit quietly as Capone attacked them. Despite the doubts, some evidence supports the tale. Capone biographers Max Allan Collins and A. Brad Schwartz discovered accounts of the event in early press reports, suggesting the story might have been deliberately spread by the Chicago outfit to bolster Capone's fearsome reputation. George Meyer, a close associate of Capone, even claimed to have witnessed both the planning and the killings. By 1930, Aiello's scheming against Capone had reached its peak. Exhausted from constant hiding and the deaths of his allies, Aiello sought refuge with Unione Siciliana treasurer Pasquale Prestigiacomo in Chicago. But on October 23rd, as Aiello left Prestigiacomo's apartment to hail a cab, he was ambushed. A gunman from a second-floor window opened fire with a submachine gun, hitting Aiello at least 13 times. Staggering around the corner to escape, Aiello unwittingly moved into the line of fire from a second gunman on the third floor, who delivered the fatal shots. Capone had finally silenced his most persistent foe. In the aftermath of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, Chicago's lawlessness reached a breaking point, prompting Walter A. Strong, publisher of the Chicago Daily News, to take drastic action. Just 2 weeks after President Herbert Hoover's inauguration, Strong arranged a secret meeting at the White House on March 19, 1929, bringing along Frank Loesch of the Chicago Crime Commission and attorney Laird Bell. Their message was clear. Chicago was in the grip of gangsters like Al Capone, and local law enforcement was powerless against them. They pleaded with Hoover for federal intervention, arguing that only the federal government could restore order. In his 1952 memoir, Hoover recalled how Strong made the case that the police and magistrates were completely under the gangsters' control. Hoover responded immediately, directing all federal agencies to concentrate their efforts on bringing Capone and his allies to justice. This set the stage for a coordinated, multi-agency attack on Capone's empire, with the Treasury and Justice Departments devising plans to target Capone through income tax evasion, a strategy that would ultimately lead to his downfall. To bolster these efforts, a select group of incorruptible Prohibition agents, famously dubbed the Untouchables by Chicago Daily News writer Charles Schwartz, was assembled to go after Capone's bootlegging operations. Elliot Ness and his squad became legendary for their relentless pursuit of justice. Behind the scenes, Strong secretly used his newspaper's resources to gather intelligence on Capone's network, funneling crucial information to federal investigators. It was the beginning of the end for Capone's reign over Chicago. On March 27, 1929, Al Capone found himself in FBI custody after leaving a Chicago courtroom. He had just testified before a grand jury investigating federal prohibition violations when agents arrested him, charging him with contempt of court for faking illness to dodge an earlier court appearance. This marked the beginning of a series of legal troubles that would steadily unravel Capone's empire. Just weeks later, on May 16, 1929, he was arrested again, this time in Philadelphia, for carrying a concealed weapon. Capone didn't fight the charges. The very next day he pled guilty and was sentenced to a year in prison. By August, he was serving time at Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary, where his confinement was surprisingly lenient. However, Capone's public image was tarnished further when, upon his release in March 1930, the Chicago Crime Commission officially declared him Public Enemy Number 1. This label heightened public scrutiny and intensified the federal government's pursuit of him. Capone's troubles didn't stop there. In April 1930, he was arrested in Miami Beach on vagrancy charges as part of a campaign to drive him out of the state. Claiming police mistreatment, Capone was later charged with perjury for his statements, but was acquitted. His legal entanglements continued into 1931, when a Chicago judge issued another arrest warrant for vagrancy. Capone's organization, meanwhile, was connected to the murder of Julius Rosenheim, a longtime police informant in the Chicago outfit. Despite his best efforts to avoid conviction, the walls were closing in on Capone as federal authorities prepared their final strike. Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt pioneered a groundbreaking approach to taking down wealthy criminals like Al Capone, using federal tax evasion laws. In 1927, the Supreme Court's ruling in United States versus Sullivan confirmed that even illegally earned income was subject to taxation. This legal precedent laid the groundwork for Capone's eventual downfall, but it wasn't his lavish spending that sealed his fate. It was the income he tried to regularize. Capone's brother Ralph, himself a notorious gangster, was convicted of tax evasion in 1930, spending 18 months in prison. Al, fearing the same fate, had his lawyer admit to the government that Capone had earned $100,000 in income for the years 1928 and 1929, inadvertently providing the evidence that would come back to haunt him. On March 13, 1931, Capone was secretly charged with tax evasion for 1924, and by June he faced 22 counts of tax evasion from 1925 to 1929, along with 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act relating to Prohibition. Capone initially attempted a plea bargain, pleading guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence of 2.5 years. But Judge James Herbert Wilkerson, overseeing the trial, rejected the deal. Capone's defense, hastily prepared after the failed plea, crumbled under the weight of the prosecution's evidence, which included witnesses and ledgers implying his control over a massive illegal operation. The government charged Capone with evading $215,000 in taxes on over $1 million in income between 1925 and 1929. On October 17, 1931, Capone was convicted of 5 counts of income tax evasion and a week later sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000 and ordered to pay $215,000 in back taxes and interest. His appeal efforts, including a writ of habeas corpus, failed when a judge ruled that the time Capone had spent outside Chicago extended the statute of limitations on his prosecution. Capone's iron grip on Chicago had finally been broken, not by violence or rival gangsters, but by the government's persistent legal pursuit. In May 1932, at the age of 33, Al Capone was sent to the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. Upon his arrival, doctors officially diagnosed him with syphilis and gonorrhea. He was also struggling with withdrawal from cocaine, which had severely damaged his nasal septum. Despite his notorious reputation, Capone quickly became a shadow of his former self. Though he performed his prison job, stitching shoe soles for 8 hours a day, competently, his letters were barely legible, and his once dominant personality seemed to crumble under the strain of prison life. His cellmate, Red Rudensky, a former small-time criminal who had ties to Capone's gang, noticed how vulnerable Capone was and took on the role of protector, fearing the gangster would suffer a mental breakdown. Capone's visible need for protection sparked rumors that he was receiving special treatment, even though no solid proof ever surfaced. Still, the suspicions contributed to his transfer in August 1934 to Alcatraz, the newly opened maximum security prison off the coast of San Francisco. It was here that Capone's health began to deteriorate rapidly. On June 23, 1936, he was stabbed by fellow inmate James C. Lucas, though he only sustained superficial injuries. While Capone's behavior remained good enough to allow him to play banjo in the prison band, the Rock Islanders' neurosyphilis was slowly eroding his mental faculties. By February 1938, Capone's condition had worsened, and he was diagnosed with syphilis of the brain. His mental decline became so severe that he spent his final year at Alcatraz in the prison hospital, disoriented and confused. On January 6, 1939, Capone was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in California to complete his sentence for contempt of court. Later that year, on November 16th, he was paroled after his wife, May, appealed to the court, citing his deteriorating mental state. Capone left prison as a broken man, far removed from the fearsome figure who once ruled Chicago's streets. Al Capone's conviction in 1931 marked the end of his reign as the boss of Chicago's infamous criminal empire, but it didn't destroy the outfit as many had hoped. Upon Capone's imprisonment, his underboss, Frank Nitti, assumed control after his release from prison in March 1932, having also been convicted of tax evasion. While Nitti kept the outfit running, the group's operations became less conspicuous than under Capone's violent rule, avoiding the kind of public attention that had led to Capone's downfall. With Prohibition repealed in 1933, organized crime shifted its focus to other lucrative enterprises such as prostitution, labor union racketeering, and gambling, allowing the outfit to thrive without facing major investigations. Though the power structure of Chicago's underworld became murky in the following decades, leading to disagreements about who truly controlled the outfit, Capone's former associates continued to dominate. By the late 1950s, FBI agents discovered that many of Capone's former lieutenants were still at the helm, keeping organized crime alive in the city. One lingering mystery from Capone's era was the 1939 murder of Edward J. O'Hare, a lawyer who had helped federal prosecutors convict Capone. Some historians speculate that Capone, even from behind bars, ordered O'Hare's assassination as revenge, though other theories suggest alternative motives for his death. Due to his rapidly declining health, Al Capone was released from prison on November 16, 1939, and referred to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore for treatment of syphilitic paresis, a severe neurological consequence of his untreated syphilis. However, due to his notorious reputation, Johns Hopkins refused to admit him. Fortunately, Baltimore's Union Memorial Hospital took him in, and Capone was so grateful for their care that he donated 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees to the hospital. After a few weeks of treatment, Capone, still in poor health, left Baltimore on March 20, 1940, and returned to his Palm Island mansion in Florida. In 1942, Capone became one of the first patients in the US to be treated with the newly mass-produced penicillin, which helped slow the progression of his disease, though it was too late to reverse the extensive damage to his brain. By 1946, doctors concluded that Capone had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. He spent his final years at his Florida mansion, surrounded by his wife and grandchildren, living quietly as his health continued to deteriorate. On January 21, 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. Although he briefly regained consciousness, he soon developed bronchopneumonia and had a cardiac arrest the following day. On January 25, 1947, Capone passed away in his Palm Island home, surrounded by his family. His body was returned to Chicago for a private funeral and was initially buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery. In 1950, his remains, along with those of his father and brother, were moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where Capone rests today.